So congratulations on the documentary Shot in the Arm. It's one of the most frustrating things I think I've seen in a couple of weeks. And I think it stems from the fact that I work in news. I've been to several close, for example, conferences where they're just sharing all kinds of misinformation and hyping each other up. Tell us a little bit about the documentary and where it started and what it ended up evolving into.
Sure. The background on the film is kind of interesting along those lines, Manny. In 2018, late 2018, I was contacted by a dear friend and doctor, John Schwartzberg, out of the Berkeley Wellness Letter. And he said, Scott, what's your next film going to be? You need to take on these anti-vaxxers. And in my wisdom, I said, oh, no, they're going to burn out. We don't need to deal with them. How could they possibly last? Cut to just 4 months later, and we have in the spring of 2019, a state of emergency in New York City, state of emergency in Washington State, measles outbreak, state of emergency, and measles outbreaks all across Europe. And I wondered why this is happening. And of course, the answer was there were certain people that were convincing families to not vaccinate, mostly through disinformation, spreading fear. And I contacted Dr. Paul Offit first. And he was extremely generous with his time and introduced me to sort of all the players on the public health side. And then, as I like to do, I want to see what the other side is doing as well, not just in archival footage. I reached out and started following the top people on the anti-vax side as well, Robert Kennedy Jr., Del Bigtree, and Andrew Wakefield. And we thought we had a pretty interesting and fascinating, complicated movie in 2019. And then COVID happened, and it went to this whole other place.
Yeah, it's interesting how documentaries sometimes evolve like that. You start with something, and then I mean that in itself in the debate with the vaccine became so polarizing in everything, even to just to the point, even in your film, how you say January 6th, it also became a thing on that day, which is
I would add
incredible.
that it would have been a perfectly legitimate documentary had it only just been about measles if COVID had never occurred. And so it wasn't simply that COVID added another sort of virus to the discussion. It added an entire cultural perspective where the politics and leading forces operating on both sides of the political spectrum coming together on the other side of the fence, right? These are people that would normally just badmouth each other for being so extreme in whatever is their political followings, and yet they meet on the same side of the fence for different reasons in their rejection of vaccines. And for me, that was a whole part of this documentary that Scott was able to explore that would not have been there without COVID. And now it's a movie about social contracts and culture and human susceptibility to a much deeper story of human susceptibility to misinformation.
Yeah, Neil, I wanted to ask you. So, what is happening? Maybe I'm just not caught up with it, but more than ever, what's going on that we're just not? And I don't mean me, but there's a large part of our culture that's just not trusting science anymore. I mean, it just seems very black and white sometimes, and there's these people who are just like, no, just that's not true.
You tell me. I'm like, I mean, we could start with the flat earthers, right? That's a whole movement with conferences and things. And so I take a kind of a cop-out response to that question. It's a cop-out because the answer is simple, I think. It's simple and hard. We need to teach science differently in school so that as adults, people will not think of science as just some temporary body of knowledge that just happens to be true at any moment. But then you could discount it if you have some other pathway that you believe gives you access to truth. You do 2 hours of your own work on Google, and now right? This is a point I made in my master class, where there are people who know enough about a subject to think they're right, but not enough about that same subject to know that they're wrong. And so they build platform and they get followings. This is the whole social media currency. What is your following? And if I don't do the 2 hours of work, but you do, and I follow you, now both of us are thinking the same way. And there was one of the basketball players, I forgot which, it might have been Kyrie Irving, who was all into flat Earth.
Yeah.
But then he later confessed he just fell down a rabbit hole on YouTube. And YouTube is feeding him the things that they know he kept looking at, and they were not feeding him other views, more authentic views. And he doesn't have he's a basketball player. We're good with that, okay? Plus, you can play basketball and still think Earth is flat because the court is flat. Right? So, you know, as long as he doesn't become head of NASA, we're still good in the world. Right. But what he confessed was the power of these forces operating on him without him having a separate toolkit to sift through who are the charlatans and who are the authentic sources. So my cop-out answer is, yeah, we have to change the education system so that adults are not so susceptible, because it's not, what do you gain by running around hitting people on the head? It's their life. It's a free country, you know, and their heels are dug in and they have a community. Community turns out to be a big part of this. Who would have thought? Yes. The psychologists of recent years tell us that the communities, we all think the same way. And if you don't, then you're not in this community. We value community more than we value truth. And that may have evolutionary tracking back when tribes mattered for our survival. All right, you go back 20,000, 30,000 years, your group has to stay together. If you're an outlier from it, it could risk your security, your health. There's power in the tribe. So a feature of the film is that, no, it doesn't beat the anti-vaxxers over the head who were sucked into the movement. It really just targets those who are leaders of the movement. And it shows a very compassionate side to those who are, otherwise I would have to call them victims of this thinking.
If I can add on to all of that, Neil, absolutely right. And then there's a tricky word in here that's also so much a part of it, is a lack of humility, to wonder, could I be wrong? Am I humble enough to ask myself, am I wrong? And to use the tools of science to check myself to see if I'm right or wrong.
These are tools exquisitely conceived and developed for that purpose.
That's right, but you have to have the humility to use them. That's the double edge of what you described, and that goes to what Neil said before about the social contract, Manny. That the film, I didn't know when we started that we were making a film about the social contract, but the social contract has become one of the most important things for the film. That it's not a COVID film, right? It is a COVID film in sort of in clothing, but it's really a film about our social contract and the fragility of the foundations of our democracy. And that is where we've seen the film be.
Just to be clear, the foundations of an informed democracy. Democracy doesn't work if people are making uninformed decisions or misinformed decisions. Then you can't collectively arrive at a new place that benefits us all. So that's the real source of the fragility of democracy. And I'll add, because Scott was well along before I was brought onto the project to help steer and guide some of the messaging, just given my life experience as an educator and as someone who's trying to cut through the brush and bramble of the tangled mental pathways that cloud people's thinking about issues that affect us all. I would say this concept of a social contract, I had heard the term, but I'd never gotten into it before working on this film. And it's a great concept. It's what is your obligation to yourself, clearly, but when you're part of a community, when you're part of civilization, what is your obligation to us all? And unless we all just want to become survivalists Well, that's not okay, I guess, but you still depend on, if you're not a survivalist living alone in a cave somewhere,
Yeah.
well, that's not why we built civilization. Civilization requires some dependence on one another for our collective good. And I think the documentary does, and I'd say this even if I weren't a participant, I think the documentary does it brilliantly. And I love, by the way, I'm highly sought after for my narration voice. And I'm glad I did not narrate this film, because Scott is the authentic, natural voice, especially since we see through that lens, he's got a school teacher as a wife. Okay. So this is free footage right there. And we see the graduation, we see, and it's Scott's voice. And it's not it's not this heavily rehearsed voice of God. It's not this NPR voice. It's not it's Scott. And that is so real to the viewer and listener that I think it magnifies the message that this film affects us all.
Yeah, I really
Don't let me stop you, Neil, from complimenting me. I'll never.
Scott, I really enjoyed some of the shots you chose, especially because that's when I understood, really watching it, that about how much the social aspect plays in the misinformation. You had people like Robert Kennedy, Andrew Wakefield, Adele Bigtree, but you had shots of so many people surrounding them, telling them, "Thank you for saving our children. Thank you for this," and just like soaking it in. And I thought to myself, I was like, even if they had proper information, at that point, they're not going to let that go. It could be because now all of a sudden they become like a beacon of hope in their eyes.
Champion. They've been
a community.
They found
right?
a champion in their lives.
Champion.
That's very astute. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a perceptive fact.
And
like even in that moment, if they're confronted with objectively true information, verifiably objectively true, they've got their hero. And one of the great lines in the film is RFK Jr. saying, in another society, or whatever, in another society, they'd be building statues to Andrew Wakefield. And this is a person who's been discredited. So medically, professionally, and in every other important way. By the way, just to be clear, and by the way, this is a point, one of the things, if you want to know what the hell am I doing associated with the film, again, I'm advising on messaging. So initially, the Andrew Wakefield clips were just that he had a wrong result that was never verified. But in science, there's nothing wrong with a wrong result. We get those all the time. That wasn't the issue with Andrew Wakefield. It's that he was paid by an attorney firm to come up with a result that they could then cite in lawsuits against Big Pharma. That's the fraud. It's not just he got some experiment that didn't happen to be right. God, science on the frontier, there's no telling what's right until something's verified. Nobody could verify his result. And so now we know what's behind it. So
sadly, his fraud was still effective.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that part of the story, so that got added and told, so that the fraudulent part mattered. It wasn't just that he got something wrong. So, right. and his paper was not retracted. But that's not the word they use.
I was retracted almost 10 years. Yeah.
Retracted. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was not retracted for being wrong. It was retracted for the fraudulent framing of how and why he came up with those results. But he's still on the circuit, right? There it is.
Still,
so what are we going to do?
Very effective communicator. So I would point out a little nuance if I hope you're going to cut this up, Manny, but to go back to your correct observation that these people, and we tried very hard to distinguish between people who were skeptical and scared and fearful around could a vaccine possibly harm their child, and the people that fomented disinformation purposely to do harm to those people. But and we saw that, you pointed that out very astutely. Let's look at a little upside of what we can do as human beings, that we have Lynette in the film, who was an anti-vaxxer for a long time, the one with the tattoos, and was very fearful of vaccines causing harm to her child. And she chose, while not completely giving up on some of her fears and around disinformation of vaccines, she chose decency. She chose a pivot in decency. And at the end of the film, we see her going from being a sycophant to somebody like Del Bigtree to saying, no, that man is not the type of communicator I want to be associated with. And she had Dr. Paul Offit on her podcast to say, I want to have a conversation about decency and humility and try to heal these divides even a little bit. And that's really another part of the film. We're so happy with it. It is hopeful after all this brutality that we've gone through. That it is hopeful that the human condition, what we can do as human beings, we can be awful, we can be selfish, and we also can do this.
Yeah, that's all Scott as a filmmaker. I'm not that good at thinking how to make a film to know that would be a really good piece of that storytelling. So yeah, I think that's just in the last 5 minutes of the film, right? As the film sort of winds you, preps you to exit the experience, you land in some places that do give you a tremendous amount of hope.
It's tough because as a parent myself, I mean, that fear does come from a good place where what's best for my child. But I think that you have these people that then prey on that. And I think it's even worse when you're in a community space, like you guys show some of the meetings for actual information, for actual, and these people take those open mics to rile everyone up. And I mean, the theme of the whole thing, the community sense, like, I don't want to be against all of these people. So
another one of my favorite lines is, Scott, I forgot which of the nurses who said this.
Yeah.
She said that we have these anti-vax leaders selling you misinformation.
Yeah.
Where all we're doing is just offering the truth.
Karen Ernst, Karen Ernst. That's amazing. And he's selling it. Talk about Bigtree. He's selling it. He's selling a lie, and he's selling it hard. And all we're trying to do is just offer you the truth humbly. Well, Neil, you're pointing out the contrast, the double edge of how difficult this is. Look at how complicated it is to explain science and the nuance and the humility and all those things. And all an anti has to do is say the MMR vaccine causes autism, just like that. And it's awful. It's a slur is not an argument, is another way of looking at it. So
Scott, Neil, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the film. It's a real eye opener, and it's a really really interesting perspective into not just the actual misinformation, but some of the cultural things that are causing it. And hopefully it opens a lot of eyes, and it gets at least a few people to reconsider the way they think about vaccines that actually save lives.
Thank you. Nice talking.
Thanks for your interest.